Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. I recently began actually a new appointment as Associate Research Faculty at the Yale School of Medicine. I'm going to be presenting today on my work, which has been using machine learning to uncover how nature and nurture converge, specifically to understand how behavior and neuropsychiatric diseases occur. As with all things, the Holy Quran has provided very clear inspiration. I'm not sure if the audio works, but okay. So in Surah Taha, Allah the Exalted has said, "And if thou speakest aloud, it makes no difference, for He knows the secret thought, and what is yet more hidden." And in Surah Fatir, Allah has said, "Allah knows the secrets of the heavens and the earth, and He knows well all that is in their minds." So what is mean by "and yet what is more hidden"? Understanding how thought and behavior emerge has been a fundamental question in the field of neuroscience, and it's also a question that has a strong historical link to Muslim scholarship. Abu Zayd al-Balkhi of Afghanistan was one of the first to recognize that mental health disorders are intrinsically linked to human health and are not due to supernatural causes. Ibn Sina, in his Kitab al-Shifa, wrote that even mental health disorders have a physiological cause. He wrote, "The knowledge of anything, since all things have causes, is not acquired or complete unless it is known by its causes." So contemporary research scholars have continued to examine and explore ways in which the severity of neuropsychiatric conditions emerges and avenues for potential treatment and remediation. This is an active area of research and one that there still remains a great deal of ambiguity. So how does behavior emerge, and how do neuropsychiatric diseases emerge? We understand that most conditions are the result of both genetic and environmental factors. There are some conditions where you can very clearly identify a causal link between an environmental exposure and a particular behavioral outcome, for instance, in opioid use disorder or alcohol use disorder. But there are many neuropsychiatric conditions where there are environmental associations, but their causal link to a particular outcome is not well understood. Like, for instance, in the case of autism spectrum disorders, ADHD, and epilepsy. We also see that there are a number of genetic factors that have been identified and associated with particular disease outcomes. The use of genomic-wide association studies are very commonplace and have been performed for many behaviors and neuropsychiatric conditions. And they have found that there are associations between particular genetic differences between individuals and particular behavioral outcomes. So how exactly was this done? So in order to make these assessments, large quantities of data are needed. You need a large cohort of individuals that both have a particular trait and those that do not, or you need individuals that have one particular trait or an alternative trait. You then determine whether a particular genetic variant, a tiny sliver of DNA between these individuals is different or if it's the same. And if you find that there is a particular genetic variant that is more common in one population versus the other, then you have an association. You show that, okay, this variant is more likely to occur in this group of people. But that is not the whole story. Establishing the causality of these genetic variants is a huge challenge. One of the common phrases that you'll hear if you ever take a statistics class is, correlation does not imply causation. There's an entire website devoted towards exploring these spurious correlations, which you should definitely check out if you want to get a good laugh. One of these examples are that you can see that air pollution in New York City is correlated with the distance between Neptune and the Sun. As you probably know, there isn't really any relationship, causal or otherwise, between these two factors. They're both rather correlated with the passage of time. If there are any astronomers in the room, they can correct me, but I believe that the orbit of Jupiter or Neptune is about 165 years. So you'll eventually see that this correlation will break down in time. But the point is that you shouldn't rely purely on correlational studies to make an assessment of biology. It doesn't really tell you anything that'll be useful for understanding the disease, and it may lead you on the wrong path. So that is why we need techniques that provide a more nuanced understanding as to connecting the fundamental parts of the genetic sequence to their high-level phenotypic behavioral outcomes. Now, this was a really challenging problem, as the human genome is made of of 3 billion base pairs, and only 1% to 2% of the human genome is actually responsible for creating proteins, which are the building blocks of the human body. So even if you can identify genetic variants that are associated with a particular condition, their high-level outcome isn't immediately clear. Complicating this is that there are 80 to 400,000 proteins. So even if you do identify a variant that is linked to a protein, identifying its responsibility and role can sometimes be very challenging, especially as there are 411 different cell types that it could possibly be acting in. And this is only a small fraction of the scope of the human body as a complex system where there are 30 to 40 trillion human cells. So being able to pinpoint the effect that a specific genetic variant or genetic variation has across different cells in the responsibility of making different proteins, in the responsibility of regulating different genes, this has been a major problem in biology, and it's one that has confounded some of the approaches towards being able to map how behavior emerges from underlying genetic variation. So this is where machine learning comes in. It can help to bridge the relationship between genetic variants and high-level behavioral outcomes. In my particular work, I have focused on the study of opioid use disorder. So how do genetic variants give rise to high-level phenotypes such as susceptibility to addiction? Why is it that certain individuals are more likely to develop long-term addiction when they're exposed to opioids than others? So to answer this question, I've used a number of different methods. One of the most straightforward, which builds on many of the univariate approaches that are used in GWAS, for instance, is using linear classifiers. So essentially the goal of these techniques are, can we find the variables that are the best at predicting one particular outcome or the other? This can help us narrow our field of search to only those variables that are likely to be very critically important. One of the other approaches is using unsupervised learning, where we essentially allow our data to create its own labels, where we can identify subgroups that would not have been directly identified by us, but may be present using metabolomic data, using genetic data, using epigenomic data. So this allows us to uncover possible paths of interest that wouldn't be clear initially if we were to just make a head-to-head comparison between two groups. And the other is the use of deep learning methods, such as natural language processing inspired techniques. DNA is the language for coding proteins, but it's also the instructions for what cell each protein should be expressed in, the degree to which it should be expressed, and the state in which it should be modulated off. So transformers allow us to learn this language of DNA and then to make informed prediction in different cell types, in different contexts, in different environmental perturbations. And this allows us to then find the variables that are responsible for our condition of interest, in this case, opioid use disorder. So in my work, I was able to use a combination of all three of these techniques to identify genetic variants that are associated with opioid use disorder, but are also linked to the epigenomic modification of individuals that have been exposed to opioids. And we see that these variables that are the best at distinguishing between them are also the ones that happen to have the most genetic variants that are also in those regions. And so we explored these regions further downstream, where we found that they were responsible for genes that regulate perception of pain. So we were able to make a link between the underlying genetic variant and the ultimate high-level outcome, which is differences in pain tolerance or response to pain. So this is something that is really exciting and allows us to potentially identify a mechanism for screening patients who are more susceptible to opioid use disorder risk, and as well as being able to design treatments that may not necessarily target these specific pathways. So the complexity of biological systems necessitates strategies that can comprehensively account for many variables. Machine learning has a number of tools that are particularly well suited for this set of questions. And these methods can give us insight into biology that may have otherwise eluded us and have a lot of potential for therapeutic development as well as personalized medicine. I'm really excited to see this work. It should be published in the next few months, and Jazakallah so much for everyone's time.
Jazakallah.